Now, I'm sure that most of you know the old story about the astronaut who went far out into space and was asked on his return whether he had been to heaven and seen God. And he said yes. And so they said to him, well, what about God? And he said, she is black. And I've read a great deal of theological reasoning about the existence of God, and they all start out on this line. If you are intelligent and reasonable, you cannot be the product of a mechanical and meaningless universe. Figs do not grow on thistles. Grapes do not grow on thorns. And therefore, you, as an expression of the universe, as an aperture through which the universe is observing itself, cannot be a mere fluke.
Black identity is a subject constantly being called into question, both implicitly and explicitly, and more often than not, by people who aren't of the black social group, but still can't help but have their say in who and what we are, whether we have a right to exist, and which of our histories we are allowed to keep, and which of our histories they are going to adopt for themselves. Because white fragility cannot and never has been able to coexist with the factual reality of our multi-ethnic world.
You either fight back or you die. You either fight back or you die.
Nor its past, of which their ethnic group had, given the length of that human history, a relatively minimal part to play. The very social construction of the so-called black race is itself an identity implanted upon so-called black people, by people who wanted to create a politically incentive, ethnic social group for themselves, to maintain not only institutionally constructed white supremacy as a dichotomy to institutionally constructed black inferiority, but also the financial lucrativeness of chattel slavery that relied upon the dehumanization of peoples of the black social group, in order for its survival, preventing the impoverished working peoples of the New World, both slaves and indentured servants, from unifying against the slaveholding proletariat or ruling class. Our identity, given the present geopolitical and institutional imbalance of power in the colonial era, has been presented to us and the world for so long that it has forced the world, and more importantly, black peoples, into accepting to some extent the imposition of identity onto us by people who aren't us and more often than not hate us. With a historical perspective, we must accept therefore that so-called black identity has until now been an ahistorical myth, a colonial idea presented to the world to achieve political and psychological ends. Therefore, as we continue to emerge with no short amount of hardship into a truly post-colonial world, we must, as black people, make conscious efforts to discard the perception of ourselves forced up on us and stand in the mirror unclouded by the rhetoric of centuries of propaganda that has been for far too long, whether we like it or not, the lens through which we understand ourselves and the only lens through which our children have been given the possibility to do so as well.
Which doll is the black doll? And which one is the white doll?
That one.
Which doll is the pretty doll? Which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll? Which doll is the nice doll? And which doll is the bad doll? And why is that doll pretty?
Because she's white and she has 2 eyes.
Which doll is the ugly doll? Why is that doll ugly?
Because she's black.
Which doll looks most like you?
Like me?
Yeah, which one looks like you?
And that one,
Okay.
no.
Towards discarding destructive self-perceptions of Black identity, a valuable place to start can be with addressing the exonym Black. This is not a trivial starting point, for the importance of names is misunderstood and completely underappreciated within the Western thought that has been violently exported to so much of the world, especially the ex-colonies. Within African cosmologies, we find that one's name is held in sacred regard, possessing substantial, innate power, and is an essential aspect of the balance of the material and the spiritual, otherwise known as above and below, that coexist within and without human beings. George G. James elucidates this on page 124 of his 1954 work, Stolen Legacy, stating that it must be noted that according to the Egyptian concept, the soul has 9 parts, whose unity is so complete that even the Ren, the name, is an essential attribute, since without it, it cannot exist. The Ren, the name, or the essential attribute of the preservation of a being. The Egyptians believed in the absence of a name, an individual ceased to exist. The sanctity of our names is likewise prevalent in other African spiritual frameworks. Within the Yoruba, for example, elucidated by Benson Igboin in his 2014 An African Religious Discourse on Names and Identity. There are no single family names shared by everybody in a given family. Ayandele has argued that the Yoruba do not have family names because of the sacred nature of one's father's name, such that no younger members dare mention it, even after a father's death. The adoption of surnames in Africa, by the will of colonialists, is believed to have destroyed the reverence and respect accorded them. In Nigeria, the British introduced it. Further still, in the African tale of Isis and Ra, the ancient Kemetic goddess gains the power of the sun god by inflicting him with a snake bite and demanding his secret name in exchange for her treating his affliction. In a quote from the story in Geraldine Harris's 1996 Gods and Pharaohs from Egyptian Mythology, Ra speaks on the importance of the trade. Isis said nothing and knelt beside the sun god while his pain mounted. When it became unbearable, Ra ordered the other gods to stand back while he whispered his secret name to Isis. Now the power of the secret name has passed from my heart to your heart, said Ra wearily. In time you can give it to your son, but warn him never to betray the secret. Isis nodded and began to chant a great spell that drove the poison out of the limbs of Ra, and he rose up stronger than before. The sun god returned to the boat of millions of years, and Isis shouted for joy at the success of her plan. She knew now that one day Horus, her son, would sit on the throne of Egypt and wield the power of Ra. Names are therefore not only empowering, but can be disempowering if abused, creating balances of power and influence between those that exchange, share and place those names upon others. The implications of this are stark and troubling. Until now, the name we have used for our collective identity as Black people is the same name formed and imposed on us during the eras of genocide and chattel slavery that destroyed so many innocent lives. We may be physically living in the 21st century, but within the African framework, that aspect of our souls never left the past, and those responsible for giving us the name never lost that power over us. That's not to say blackness of identity can't be reclaimed, but the blackness we reclaim will not be the blackness of identity we are using today. That is ingrained within the fabric of white supremacist Western thought. That the N-word has become so normalized, within the black art pushed by so many Caucasian-owned music labels under the guise of reclamation is equally problematic. It's not reclamation if it was never your name in the first place. Benson Igboin again sums up this paradigm. Anthony Echekwube instantiates the import of African names when he avers that names are not just signs, but also symbols that evaluate nature, essence, characteristics, functions, and orientation of an object, person, or place, relative to what role it plays in the sight and understandings of the one who gives the name. In other words, names encapsulate the totality of humanity and nature on the one hand, and on the other, they depict intimate relationships between the named and the namer. In this case, the intimate relationship of destruction between us, the named, and them, the namers. The naming must instead become an intimate, constructive relationship, based in mutual understanding of ourselves and each other within our collective. Without delving any further into the depth-defying cosmology of naming conventions within African spirituality, some might argue that within the Western framework, we also possess personal first names, many of those indigenous names given to us by our parents. To that I would say, until somebody speaks to you and has the courtesy to ask for and accept your personal name, your name is until that point only black. To the police officer that sees you walking down the street, your name is black. To the person serving you coffee, your name is black when you step through the door at your job interview. Your name is black, and in our racialized world, even if somebody does know your name, you are arguably, before your personal name, and even to those that have full knowledge of that name, just black. The power of that evil shouldn't be underestimated. Racism permeates our consciousness and or subconscious at all times of the day, every day, all year, and is far more powerful at this moment in history than your single personal name, because it is a collective, worldwide, mass consciousness, not merely an individual one. Sociologist Robin DiAngelo speaks to this in her 2018 works, White Fragility. We are socialized into these groups collectively. In mainstream culture, we all receive the same messages about what these groups mean, why being in one group is a different experience from being in another, and we also know that it is better to be in one of these groups than to be in its opposite. For example, to be young rather than old, able-bodied rather than have a disability, rich rather than poor. We gain our understanding of group meaning collectively through aspects of the society around us that are shared and unavoidable. Television, movies, news items, song lyrics, magazines, textbooks, schools, religion, literature, stories, jokes, traditions and practices, history, and so on. These dimensions of our culture shape our group identities. Our understanding of ourselves is necessarily based on our comparisons with others. The concept of pretty has no meaning without the concept of ugly. Smart means little without the idea of not smart or stupid, and deserving has no meaning without the concept of undeserving. We come to understand who we are by understanding who we are not. But because of our society's emphasis on individuality, many of us are unskilled at reflecting on our group memberships. To understand race relations today, we must push against our conditioning and grapple with how and why racial group memberships matter. Adding to this, no person speaking about a group can know every individual within that group, and so necessarily, any perception of a group of so-called black people, of the entire social group itself, notices only black. This again isn't to say that there is a universal problem with the word black. After all, the color black is the literal color of the universe, of the night sky filled with stars. It's the color of the lethal edge of volcanic obsidian glass, the regal beauty of the panther. In fact, to observe the world objectively is to realize that not a lot of things that are black are negative at all, and that blackness should, if framed objectively, have positive connotations. So why doesn't it? To answer that, we must remember that the Western worldview is for many the global worldview, and within that Western worldview, the colour black has unfortunately been given almost only negative connotations.
What a writer is obliged at some point to realize is that he's involved in a language which he has to change. For example, for a black writer, especially in this country, to be born into the English language is to realize that the assumptions of the language, the assumptions on which the language operates, are his enemy. When Othello kills Desdemona, for example, he says, "I threw away a pearl richer than all my tribe." I was very young when I read that, and I wondered about that. Richer than my tribe? I really had to think about being as black as sin, as black as night, black-hearted. And in order, this is another story which I won't go into, in order to deal with that, really, to deal with that, at a certain time in my life, when I was not in this country, but in France, where I could not speak to anybody because I spoke no French, but no one wanted to speak to me, I dropped into a silence in which I heard, for the first time, really heard, and began to be able to try to deal with the beat of the language of the people who had produced me.
That leads me on to a suggestion of a new identification, and not one that anybody has to take on board, but simply one amongst multiple new identifications we will need to consider in the interest of moving beyond the socially enforced collective name, Black. Another great channel that has likewise contributed to this discourse is Scion of Culture, who recently suggested his own new name for so-called Black peoples, which you can come to terms with by checking out his video on the topic. Contributing my own perspective to the discourse, I'm going to be suggesting the name Earthen. My reasoning is as follows. Firstly, finding a name for our people isn't so simple as finding one that fits well within a story or rolls off the tongue. Names change all the time. Our identity, whatever it evolves into, will likely continue to evolve and eventually change again. Moors, Garamantes, Saracens, Negroes, Blacks have all been ethnic sobriquets used by others to classify us. Our focus right now then is not really creating a new name, but escaping an old harmful one. Therefore, it is strategically incentive to create one that sticks and that can catch on quickly. A name that maintains the familiarity of describing one's colour, whilst also conveying shared understanding and deeper meaning, is a reasonable, strategic middle ground. Earthen could be said to achieve this. I'll explore that deeper meaning in a moment, but practically speaking, Earthen is English, or Germanic in origins. That language has been violently exported to most of the world and has asserted itself in the 21st century as the most widely spoken language in the world. The word earthen, with widespread recognitions of the word earth and its meaning, can spread quickly, especially to English-speaking ex-colonies, of which much of the so-called Black diaspora is a part. Superficially, earthen also addresses the surface-level colour or melanation of so-called Black people in all our diverse tones, the diverse tones of fertile soil from which all life on this planet emerges are the same colour as us. This introduces earthen's double meaning, that being the identification of so-called black peoples with the earth itself. Taking firstly a historical perspective, human life emerged in Africa. When the earth produced human beings, it produced so-called black peoples, and those so-called black peoples spread to every corner of the world. Not only that, but in all those corners of the world, they stayed for what has been most of human history. Sure, social categories of white and Asian exist, as does the biology of low melanin concentration that partially defines the social category of white, but those biological realities have only emerged relatively recently when compared to so-called black people, and has always sat on that constant foundation of a oneness of so-called black African identity, from which those isolated ethnic offshoots have emerged. If the earth kept a record of all its friends, so-called black people would be the OGs, not to mention the most numerous. That's 2 identifications so far, so-called black identities, ethnic origins as well as colour, being recognizably earthen in nature. Further still, we might address what it is in our skin that creates that colour, melanin, a photosynthetic compound with the ability to convert the ultraviolet light emitted by all the stars in the known universe, including the one at the center of our solar system, into usable energy. Melanin, a pigment which, just like chlorophyll, the pigment that makes leaves green, is fundamental to the photosynthetic processes of the chloroplasts that all plant life uses to likewise photosynthesize the ultraviolet light of our closest star. Melanin that is not merely skin deep, but extending to the neuromelanin that concentrates itself on the locus ceruleus of the brain.
Melanin is a sponge for light. Melanin is actually really interesting, and it's going to be one of the major pillars in my lab that we're going to be focusing on, because not only is it this pigment that absorbs all wavelengths of light from radio frequencies, aka non-native EMFs, all the way up through gamma radiation. It is a major protective mechanism against radiation in general. If we're thinking about, protecting our organs and tissues from the effects of non-native EMFs or radon or whatever other kind of gamma radiation we might be exposed to, building your melanin, building your solar callus is a great way to buffer your body against these exposures. But in addition to that, melanin is also a potent heavy metal chelator, so it can pull heavy metals out of the bloodstream and protect your tissues against damage from these heavy metals as well. Like I mentioned, melanin is likely also to play a role in the bioenergetics of the system. So if somebody is born and naturally has more melanin in their skin, it really should be seen as a blessing and as a superpower. Meanwhile, there's like this just crazy colonial mindset that is embedded within science and medicine and culture, frankly, throughout the Western world, but also within Latin America as well. I have so many friends and clients who have family in Latin America who don't want to get a tan because it's seen as being a lower class in their society. And it's just like this archaic colonial mindset where like the colonialism basically says that like, light skin is, superior in some way and that darker skin is bad or dirty or something. And it's like, actually, that is propaganda that is geared towards disempowering the population. Meanwhile, melanin is this, incredible molecule that supports health in so many different ways. So if you naturally are gifted with more melanin, the consideration that I like to bring up first and foremost is like, if we look at vitamin D as a biomarker, so, kind of just as a brief tangent, vitamin D is something a lot of people supplement with, and they think that they're doing something good. But all of the big trials, like the VITAL study, which was a massive study on vitamin D supplementation and health outcomes, showed no benefit to supplementing with vitamin D on any chronic disease states, cancers, diabetes, I think were a couple of the major outcomes they were looking at. Despite the fact that vitamin D deficiency is highly associated with the incidence and severity of multiple different disease states. So the main takeaway from that, for me, is that vitamin D is a biomarker of your time spent outdoors and not necessarily this marker that you should supplement for to optimize. Yeah, so I mean, this is the hypothesis that Dr. Herrera has proposed that directly relates to what we observed in the mushrooms, basically in Chernobyl, whereby the mechanism is this. So it is believed that melanin can be activated by light in the environment, whether it's gamma radiation or, let's say, UV light, or the light from the sun. And when it gets stimulated, that it has the ability to split water molecules into free electrons. So this is actually how photosynthesis works in plants. There's a water splitting complex that involves chlorophyll, which is what gives the green parts of plants the green pigment. So the chlorophyll absorbs the photonic energy of sunlight, and it gets powered up enough to be able to activate this water splitting complex that allows electrons to be stripped out of water. And those free electrons can then basically power metabolism. And in plants, it's used to power the production of starch, essentially, glucose production. But in humans, the idea is that our melanin, basically it's even more efficient than chlorophyll at doing this. So chlorophyll can generate 2 electrons per water molecule. Melanin, in theory, can produce actually 4 free electrons per water molecule. So the idea is that these free electrons can be generated from this stimulation of melanin by some form of high energy light, and that would then allow those electrons to directly power metabolism. And there's melanin throughout the body as well, so not only in our skin, but also in the inner ear, the nasal mucosa, the oral mucosa, deep in the brain. And actually the primary defect in Parkinson's disease is loss of melanin over time within the substantia nigra. So melanin can actually be broken down to make dopamine. Both dopamine and melanin have the same precursor, which is called tyrosine. It's an amino acid. And so in a person with Parkinson's disease where these dopamine producing cells in the substantia nigra become toxic, basically, and there's a lot of reasons why that might be. If you look at late stage Parkinson's, it's highly associated with loss of melanin in the substantia nigra. And this is also coupled with the very interesting fact that virtually no patients of African origin, so people with dark skin, do not get Parkinson's disease. And there's this very interesting embryological origin of melanocytes. So melanocytes come from the same embryo origin as the brain tissue, the skin tissue, and the immune cells as well. And so they all come from neuroectoderm. And so there is this hypothesis that Jack has largely purported that melanin, like melanocytes, can actually travel in the body as needed. So if melanin is needed somewhere, I didn't mention this earlier, but melanin is also a potent antioxidant. It can quench reactive species in the environment. So if the body senses that there is inflammation or rampant reactive oxygen species in some part of the organism, it can send more melanocytes to the area to help quench some of that. And so the idea is that in patients and people with dark skin, that there's a higher capacity to allow melanin and melanocytes to mobilize where they would need to go to prevent diseases like Parkinson's that have directly to do with this melanin issue. So it's actually like a really interesting area of study that's kind of low-hanging fruit and not being looked at enough, in my opinion. But I think it opens the door, right, to a lot of counter-narrative questions, because the mainstream narrative tells you that there's no such thing as a healthy tan, despite the fact that we've, outlined all of these benefits of melanin for not only, the skin, but for the organism as a whole. So when you start to ask these questions about like Parkinson's and melanin and how people with dark skin don't get it, it opens the door for a lot of really other inconvenient questions.
Going further still, we can finally address the statement that trees have afros. This, as you can well discern, is not a statement of fact, but a statement of comparison between the natural afro hair textures of so-called black peoples, growing outwards towards the sky, not unlike the canopies of trees themselves. Trees may not exactly have afros, and afros may not exactly be trees, but we sure look related. Siblings of one Mother Earth, who, let's be real, probably also has an afro. This observation of the natural world and its people led Brazilian artist Fabio Gomes to integrate wall art of so-called black peoples with surrounding plants and foliage as a substitution for each character's hair, with the remarkable results you're seeing on your screen now. And just like that, every tree becomes a curly-haired giant, every forest a veritable army of them. And now you can understand why Peter Jackson may have left out the leaves in his presentation of the Ents in his adaptation of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, for the implications that all of his lovable tree men suddenly looked like Snoop Dogg may not have sat well with his production team, nor as we've seen in response to recent iterations of Middle-earth cinema, with their predominantly Caucasian audience who can't handle the presence of any non-Caucasian intruders, into their colonial fantasy fiction. Who would have thought that the ethnic Caucasian homogeny of that medieval fantasy was just as fantastical as any of the goblins and dragons that populated it?
I'll give an example of one thing, which isn't from the early modern period, but it's important. There is a very famous, very famous fantasy writer that many people, I expect most people have heard of. His name was J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, J.R.R. Tolkien was a professor and a student of English mythology. And part of what he did was he explored the nature and the complexity of English mythology. Two things happened which are very, very relevant to our point of concern. And the first one is the one I want to really dwell on. In his in J.R.R. Tolkien's exploration of Norse mythology or Norse accounts of mythology related to the British Isles, he found this term Sigurwara. Sigurwara means to shine with blackness. Sigurwara. To shine with blackness, like a shiny kind of blackness or shiny darkness. The Norse writers, these ancient early medieval writers, used the term Sigurwara to describe the same people that we've been describing at the very beginning of this podcast, which is that it is used to describe people of African descent who are shining with their blackness. But Tolkien couldn't accept that the people, that this was actually being used to describe people of African descent. So he said, no, this Sigurwara cannot be used to describe Ethiopians. It can't be, because we can't have Ethiopians in these mythologies. These are mythologies for the British Isles, and it ethnically complicates things to include those people. So he mythologized those people and turned them into the fiery, warlike demons that we now refer to as the Balrogs. The Balrogs, the demons of night, the demons of fire and light that we see represented in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's Silmarillion. So these are the terminologies that would have been used to describe Ethiopians. But Tolkien mythologized them and turned them into demons of light and fire.
An uncanny parallel with the metaphysical transformation of the black image within the colonial fantasy that is the international, white supremacist social reality of the early 21st century. Blackness and so-called black people as terrifying, demons of darkness, violent existential threat, who by the gatekeeping of those with power shall not pass. True to the name, merely an isolated Middle Earth, separated from the holistic Earth proper, within which uncomfortable and terrifying realities dwell. In the shadows of ruined temples, stalk the seas on ghost ships whose sails fill with vengeful wind that carries the anguished cries of a million souls, threatening to crumble the racist hierarchies that have stood on foundations of now shifting sands for far too long. Shifting sands that once hastily obscured an identity, that never truly left us, even if it was hidden from physical sight. A meager Middle Earth, threatened at its edges by a gathering storm within which the soul of a child watches and waits, crackling with the same electric charge that pulsed through his 14-year-old skull, whilst he sat on a booster seat of old books, stacked upon one another by the adults that put him there, adults who watched and waited while his insides burned. So-called black identity, our very biology, is reflected and manifest within the natural world. Both our distinctive biologies, activated by the ultraviolet light that is the source of all life on Earth and every habitable planet in the Milky Way and the known universe. Like our sun, the stars themselves cry to melanated peoples to leap for the cosmos, recognizing ourselves in it, just as we first recognized ourselves in nature, and just as Mother Nature suffers under the pressures of Western exported industry and consumptive capitalism, so too so-called black people suffer with our mother under the very same pressures of that man-made industry of capitalist chattel slavery that turned our own bodies, just like the earth and soil, into physical tools for material enterprise, forced to till the land to fuel even more extraction of the natural resources of this world. Earthen is a word that encapsulates us and our identity as parallel with the identity of the earth within the climate of our modern world, as well as our ancient identity that lived alongside the earth in a world untainted by racist destruction. The world that is essentially the mother of us all. Within the African framework, when we describe ourselves as earthen, potentially identify as it, we essentially speak into power our shared mother's name, recognizing her presence with us. A presence that never left but suffered alongside us and heard our plight. The plight of her children. This framework allows us to understand the earth and our relationship with it, as we, or those of us fortunate enough to know our mothers, understand the relationship of our mothers to us. Why, you might ask, would our mother make us suffer? After all, the desertification of the Green Sahara, amongst numerous other tragedies of our world, was the beginning of the steady decline of African civilization in the Nile Valley and beyond, and one of the greatest tragedies to befall so-called black peoples. But a mother who shows only love to her child creates a child weak and bubbled by comfort. A mother, and father besides, know when to send their child from the nest of safety and warmth to spread their wings and fly into the unknown, cold, expansive, and oftentimes brutal world to overcome the challenges and hardship there, to grow and come back stronger. I myself am thankful to my mother for accommodating my hardships, because she knew that my overcoming of those hardships alone was essential to my growth as a person, and nonetheless, I'm sure she herself suffers to see me go through those necessary hardships without that suffering changing her mind from understanding that the hardship is nonetheless crucial, sacrificing her own peace for my development. Why does the maternal earth make her earthen children suffer? Because that is a part of being a good parent and crucial for the development of all of her earthen children, for their collective identity, and observing that suffering, our earthen mother suffers alongside us at the same hands.
Spirituality is everything. It's everything. I don't think spirituality is just what people say about being good. Actually, spirituality is also being bad. And good and evil, although there are relatives, are also part and parcel of spirituality. They're just a different part of spirituality. Spirituality is everything. It's everything. And spirituality is in everything. The next question is, what is the appropriate type of spirituality that one needs for levity, development, etc., etc.? Well, that's dependent on who you think you are, isn't it? Obviously, Donald Trump feels that what he manifests is spiritually good for him. It's a man who eats meat, red meat, who is full of vindictive kind of power and has manifested this power in terms of position and what have you in this world. And he feels, if he was to digest his activities, that what he's doing is good. It makes him feel good inside. In other words, it's a representation of his own spirituality. It's not a representation of my spirituality, but of his. Am I to say that his activity is not spiritual? No, because it's spiritual to him. His expression of spirituality is different from my expression of spirituality, but it's still spiritual to him. Mistake I would make is to make me think that he doesn't have a spirituality simply because the way that he manifests his spirituality is different to me. He does have a spirituality, even though he might not call it that, and he manifests it every day in what he does, thinks, speaks, and acts. I represent my spirituality in a different way to him because I'm a different person, physically, mentally, and spiritually to him. So what I manifest is spiritually good for me, so long as I follow the paths that are right for me. How do I know what paths are right for me? I follow nature primarily. What does nature teach me are right for me? What does nature show me is the correct thing for me to be, to do? Nature tells me, for example, that I should get up when the sun is up, when it is light. Not 8 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 5 o'clock. Nature teaches me this because the sun has already risen. Okay, what about in the winter time when the sun rises late? I still get up at that time, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, because that's what nature has told me I should do in the summertime. I continue into the winter. If I was living in another environment where perhaps I didn't need to get up at 5 or 6, then my spiritual progress would be delineated entirely by the sun, and I might need then to get up at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock. But for now, my spirituality tells me I must get up at 5, not only because the sun has risen at that time during the summertime, but also as a methodology so that I can achieve things spiritually in this time. So the time that I get up in the morning, 5 is important. 5 o'clock, 5:30 at the latest. Second of all, nature teaches me that I need to cleanse and wash my physical body. I have to cleanse it physically. I need to wash and cleanse regularly, perhaps 2, maybe 3 times a day, perhaps even 4 times a day. I need to cleanse, wash my body and oil my body from head to toe. This is part of my spirituality, my cleansing process. And in the same way that I might cleanse my physical body, I need to cleanse my mind and my spirit. I need to get rid of the waste from my body in the same way that I may urinate and defecate the waste from my system. And if I don't for one day, I'm sick. In the same way, I must cleanse my mind and my spirit of the waste and the filth that my mind and spirit has accumulated in that day. My body has turned food into energy and then needs to expel it. My spirit has also turned the light, the energy that it receives, into something else. I am full of that waste in my mind and my spirit, and I need to get rid of it in the same way that I get rid of the waste from my body. My cleansing must be holistic, choosing those systems that work, be it chanting, be it meditation, be it internal prayer, external prayer, be it physical exercise. It must involve physical exercise. Physical exercise is fundamentally important to sweat the toxins out of my body and to sweat the spiritual waste out of my body. I must know what I'm doing when I'm in meditation or in chanting or whatever. I must know what I'm doing. It cannot be magic. I don't believe in magic. I believe in spiritual processes that work, not magic. So it's about cleansing the spirit in the same way that you cleanse your body. Meditation is fundamentally important. It's as fundamentally important as drinking water, as eating food. It is as fundamental as that, as cleaning your body. You wouldn't go a day without cleaning your body in the same way you wouldn't go without a day without meditation. It's fundamentally important. One must also be in touch with nature in some form or shape, if one can be, to actually touch the earth in some form or shape. One must have one's own space. Some call it altar, some call it your own space. A space which is yours. In that space, the elements are there. Air is there, fire is there, water is there, earth is there. Above and below is also there. Within that space, you pay respect to the fact that you are a representation of all those elements manifested in form. So you are a representation of air, fire, water, and earth manifested in form. They are your father and your mother, even more than your physical mother or father are. So when you meditate, you pay respect to that which created you and everybody that is connected to you, those elements. In your space, you have your own quiet time. It's very important. The quiet time is for you to get rid of your waste. Every day you must have quiet time, even if it's only 5 minutes, where you don't talk to anybody. Your children are not there, your partner's not there, there's no TV, there's no radio. It's your own time, it's your own space. Every day you must have some sort of rigorous physical exercise, especially when you are living in an environment where racism is strong. You need to have some element of strong physical exercise, because the racism that you have accumulated has accumulated itself as a spiritual energy and force, not just in your mind, but in the organs of your body. Your heart, your liver, your lungs, your kidney has all accumulated the self-hate of racism. You need to expel those concepts, those ideas from your physical body, through meditation, through chanting, and through physical exercise. Your heart beating fast, your lungs beating fast, your liver detoxified, your kidneys detoxified of the racism that it has accumulated as a physical and spiritual force inside your being. So those are just some of the things that one should do in order to survive. The types of exercises that one does will change slightly to the environment in which one finds oneself. If one is near a lake, a freestanding lake, one can be involved in more deep spiritual breathing to inhale the waters of the lake. If one is near a free flowing and developed forest, one can be in touch with those trees in a much more symbiotic way than if one is living in the midst of a city. If one is in touch with rock formations, one can be in touch with those rock formations in a more deeply spiritual way than one if it's concrete, and so on. But wherever you are, you have to be involved in some sort of process. Even if you find yourself in a strongly urban environment, you can represent nature by having a plant. Even if you haven't got a tree. Even if you haven't got the earth itself, you can take a rock or a stone and that can be your earth. Even if you haven't got a free-flowing river, you can get a bowl of wood and fill it with water and that can be your river or your lake. But you need to have those elements in your existence, in your daily existence, every day, especially when you live in an environment where racism is strong. Because racism isn't just a physical thing, it is also a spiritual thing. It infects body, mind, and spirit. And the same way that you cleanse your body from scientific racism, you also need to cleanse your mind and your spirit from it.
As I said, this name is merely a suggestion, contributing itself to a discourse that will likely evolve over time. I would also like to say that this is not to say that so-called non-black peoples aren't earthen or connected to the earth, or that low concentrations of melanin somehow means they have fallen from grace or steered themselves away from the natural world. All peoples of this earth are fundamentally earthen, but only when willing to recognize their identity as small ethnic offshoots of the one genetically diverse Afro-descended race that humanity is. For example, so-called and socially categorized Asian people, who through our understanding of the founder effect, coupled with our recognition of out-of-Africa migrations, can be discerned as likely descending from the same common ancestor that the African Khoi and San, as well as Asia's Negrito ethnic groups and thus modern Asians, are all descended. Some of whom are admixed with the East African offshoot that after its own out-of-Africa migration lost its own melanin, and whether by founder effect, sexual selection, sexy time with Neanderthals, or the alchemical meddlings of a wizard named Yakub, became the ethnic group of today. that is so-called white people, whose actions throughout history, actions that are still ongoing, have necessitated us to have this conversation. Rick Kittles and Shamaka Keita draw attention to this genetic reality in their 1999 Interpreting African Genetic Diversity. Various populations in Africa have interacted via migrations during past history. One striking and most apparent signature of migration is the dramatic eastern to western Africa-Klein of mitochondrial DNA haplogroup L3A frequencies. Haplogroup L3A is closely related to a mitochondrial DNA haplotype common in European populations. A subgroup of related mitochondrial DNA haplotypes appears to be East African specific and may represent a common ancestral sequence for most of Europe and Eurasia. In other words, the mitochondrial DNA diversity observed in non-African populations is a subset of African mitochondrial DNA variation. We note that while this group of mitochondrial DNA haplotypes is common in Eastern Africa, it represents only a subset of the total mitochondrial DNA diversity observed throughout the African continent. A similar pattern is observed for nuclear and Y variation in Eastern Africa. There are several implications for these observations. First, it provides evidence for an African, specifically Eastern African origin for Eurasians. Second, it suggests that before major migrations occurred out of the continent, populations were diverging. These observations deconstruct racial thinking, especially the concept of racial divergence. A rejection of this shared biological identity and a clinging to artificially constructed social identities is the reason the declining populations of these socially constructed races is causing members of those social groups so much anguish.
That would be helpful to the whole room. I don't think white people should go extinct. What's the
I don't understand.
Solution to white genocide?
What do you mean genocide, bro? Let the chips fall where they may, I think.
And just breed till everybody's the same color?
Yeah, fuck it. It's gonna happen eventually. One day.
You shouldn't think that your race should be obliterated off the face of the earth, which is what a lot of white people think.
I have great self-esteem. I don't feel like they're trying to kill us.
You're saying an end result 50 years from now, something like that, where everybody's the same color, which means that white genetics, which are recessive...
But it won't, though.
Can I finish, bro?
Yeah, sure.
If you're interested, you don't have...
No,
if you're not interested, let's talk about Pokemon.
Man. Sorry, but...
Yo, let's talk about video games or something, if you're not interested.
But that decline was always inevitable because those so-called races are fundamentally artificial and were violently propagated around the globe at the expense of indigenous life, existing only within the racial mind and not in objective reality. Ethnic groups have for all time come and gone naturally, blended and merged, but the one earthen human race has and will always remain.
And he asked one more question that was really long, and I won't go through the whole thing. Now, he basically asked if there will be a time when white people as we know them today will not exist or be recognizable, and or like, will all races be blended into one race and dissolve the rest? I'm going to tell you, yes, I do think that's going to happen. You know why? Because that's where it all started. We all started from the same people, right, and spread out. And I think things come back around, right? I would challenge you, Romulus, because your descendants, if you have any, they will carry forward whatever you actually teach them to value. So the question is, what are you teaching them to value? A collection of physical features or something that actually matters? I hope you won't care what color their eyes are. They're going to care what you built, what you believed, and what you gave them to stand on. So I would say build something worth inheriting.
And one day, this earthen race will be ready to heed the call and take to the stars beyond our own, but not without first figuring out how to not leave itself behind in the process.
In addition, Elon wants to terraform Mars, and if you do that, you could then just walk off a spaceship and breathe the air. But if that's Earth Plan B, what did you do to Earth that now you got to go to Mars? If you messed up Earth, but you're good enough to turn Mars into Earth, then you can turn Earth back into Earth and never have to go there.
And to anybody of the so-called white social group watching this, who are concerned about extinction, no, white people won't go extinct, because white people as a biological reality, don't exist. Ethnic groups do, and you are one amongst a diversity of African ethnic groups that has convinced itself that it doesn't belong to the whole. If that ethnic group is absorbed back into the ethnically diverse whole, to the extent that the social group becomes unrecognizable, then you haven't yourself disappeared. Only a fabricated myth has. Your existence continues as a member of the earthen peoples of this world.
That we have to consider, first of all, that white, Malcolm said, state of mind. Because I don't want to be misunderstood as saying, I'm not talking about white people. Insofar as you think you're white, you're irrelevant.
Whether this unified common African identity will ever truly be accepted by every member of the human race is still to be determined, but not to be relied upon. It is long overdue that we begin to walk our path, regardless of who will join us, and with a willingness to tear down the barricades that attempts to obscure that path from view. The potential of this new identity emerges not within the objective reality of our time, but as a strategy within the social reality of our time, and with respect to that social reality, so-called black peoples identifying as earthen isn't to say that so-called non-black peoples aren't of the earth, but that so-called non-black peoples of the world are no longer a part of this discussion. As far as the social construction of whiteness is concerned, I don't care about your identity because I've had it plastered on every street corner, every TV and phone screen, every billboard and book and artwork that was thrust into my face throughout the UK education system, of which my own educational institution didn't let black children wear braids and forced a Rastafari child to wear a bag over his locks any time he was out in public in school uniform, under threat of expulsion and a consequential removal of his education. But I digress, because so-called white ethnic and social identity is a question of their own souls and spirituality, and unlike them, I don't desire to impose an identity upon them, even if I might recognize in them an identity that they may not fully accept. Their pursuit of identity in this world required mine to die, required untold millions of earthen men, women and children to literally die, painfully and in despair, to preserve its mythos and drunk hubris. So-called black social identity and so-called white social identity are not in reality two equal and opposite sides of the same coin or an equally distributed black and white chessboard. The chessboard is black, and in the relatively recent history of the match, a small white square has taken center stage and somehow the sole focus of everybody watching the game. As trivial as this following example may seem, it's not nearly so shallow, because this guy is not, as he claims, white I show speed next to Darren Watkins Jr.'s black I show speed. Speed is simply what he has always been, speed, and some vampire doesn't get to benefit from reducing Speed and his brand to that racially dichotomous identity so that he can colonize it for himself. The reality is that they as individuals, like so-called black and white identity, are not comparable, even if he, in historical fashion, attempts to rewrite the same cookie-cutter mythos that pretends that they are, irrespective of whether he's conscious that that is what he's doing or not. Therefore, I hereby remove myself from the harmful dichotomy of a social blackness as it exists next to the conception of a social whiteness, instead manifesting my identity as many people do, with the lineage of my mother, the earth. An identity that doesn't reject my own biological mother, for I love my biological mother, but simply recognizes a greater parent that we were all birthed from and can witness ourselves in. My hair grows like the leafy canopy of trees, emerging from earth that is the color of my melanin, that photosynthesizes ultraviolet light, fueling that growth towards the starry sky, stars beyond our own sun, that I can rest assured, in the presence of whom I will not burn, but will drink their light in turn. Just as a final note, I tend to use copyrighted materials in my videos to enhance the storytelling, but sacrifice all potential earnings on my videos as a result. If you'd like to support what I do, my Patreon link is in the description below. Anything is appreciated, otherwise stay safe and stay tuned for the next one.
Nigga, hallelujah. Nigga, hallelujah. They don't understand the things I say on Twitter.